I'm sorry, but I don't have a lawyer. The courtroom went silent. My uncle's attorney smiled, because he thought that meant I was finished. My father's house was worth nearly $1 million, and my uncle had brought documents claiming it belonged to him. I had only one folder, one envelope, and no idea whether any of it would save me. Then the judge opened my father's envelope. She read the first page. Her face changed. She looked at me like she had been waiting years for this moment. Then she said, "You don't remember me, do you?" I shook my head. My uncle suddenly whispered, "Oh no." And that was when everything changed. The courtroom was silent. I stood alone at the table, holding a brown folder while my uncle sat across the room beside an attorney who looked like he had never lost. Richard smiled when he saw me. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who already believed the ending had been decided. My father's house was becoming his. And I had no lawyer. 3 months earlier, I had been standing in that same house, sorting through my father's belongings after his funeral. He had lived there for almost 40 years. Every room carried some piece of him. The blue chair where he read every Sunday morning. The workshop where he repaired everything instead of replacing it. That house wasn't just property to me. It was the last place that still felt like Dad. My Uncle Richard knew that. Maybe that's why he waited until after the funeral. The letter arrived on Tuesday morning. I was drinking coffee when I opened it, and the words nearly made me choke. Richard was claiming ownership of the house. According to his attorney, Dad had supposedly promised the property to Richard years earlier in exchange for financial assistance. They included a copy of a handwritten agreement with Dad's signature at the bottom. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew my father. I knew his handwriting. I knew the way he crossed his T's and pressed his pen harder whenever he was angry. This signature looked like his. But the date didn't feel right. I called Richard. He answered immediately. "You're doing this?" I asked. "I'm protecting what Dad promised me. He promised me the house." Richard laughed. "Then you should have a lawyer prove it." That sentence stayed with me. Because I didn't have one. After Dad's medical bills and funeral expenses, there wasn't much money left. I had savings, but not enough for Richard's attorney. His lawyer was a polished man named Daniel Mercer, and judging by the expensive suit and leather briefcase, he was there to win. So I represented myself. It was the most frightening decision I'd ever made. Now, sitting in court, I watched Mercer rise confidently. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is straightforward." Straightforward. That word made me laugh. He explained that Richard had financially supported my father for years, that Dad had acknowledged the debt, and that the attached agreement demonstrated his intention to transfer the property. Then Mercer looked at me. "Miss Hart, unless you have evidence contradicting this document, there is little basis for your claim." My hands tightened around it. I wanted to say I had evidence, but the truth was, I wasn't sure what counted as evidence anymore. All I had was what Dad left behind. His letters, his receipts, his old property papers, and one envelope. I'd found it the night before court, tucked inside the bottom drawer of Dad's desk beneath a stack of tax records. My name was written across the front. Maya. Underneath it, in my father's handwriting, were 7 words. "If Richard ever challenges the house, read this." I hadn't opened it. Dad was always careful with instructions. If he told me to wait, I waited. So I brought it to court. The judge looked at me. "Miss Hart, do you have anything you'd like to submit?" I swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor." I placed the envelope on the table. Mercer smiled. Richard leaned back in his chair. Neither looked worried. The judge opened the envelope and removed several folded pages. She read the first page, then the second. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. She looked at the papers again, then raised her eyes toward me. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she leaned forward. "Miss Hart." My heart started pounding. "You don't remember me, do you?" I stared at her. I had never seen this judge before, or so I thought. Richard's smile disappeared. And suddenly, the courtroom didn't feel like a place where I was about to lose my father's house. It felt like a place where someone had been waiting for me to arrive. The judge kept looking at me. I couldn't move. She glanced at Richard. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I need you to explain something." Mercer stood slowly. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge lifted the first page from my father's envelope. "This document was prepared 22 years ago?" "Yes." "And you're asking this court to accept a later handwritten agreement as evidence that Mr. Hart intended to transfer ownership?" "That is correct." She nodded. Then she looked at me again. "My name is Evelyn Brooks. 22 years ago, I wasn't a judge." I stared at her. I was a legal aid attorney. Something shifted. A memory surfaced. A rainy afternoon. My father's old pickup outside a small brick office. I was 16, sitting beside him while a woman with kind eyes studied a blue folder. I remembered my father saying, "She says we don't have to sign anything today." The woman looked at me and smiled. "That's right. Never sign something you don't understand." I looked at the judge. "You're her." She smiled. "I wondered when you'd remember." Richard shifted in his chair. The judge continued. "Your father came to my office because he was concerned about financial pressure from a family member." I looked at Richard. He avoided my eyes. He was worried about losing control of this property. Mercer interrupted. "Your Honor, whatever conversations occurred decades ago are irrelevant to the current dispute." "They may be," Judge Brooks said calmly, "which is why I'm not ruling on memory. I'm ruling on documents." She picked up another page. "This is a certified copy of the original deed." Mercer stopped smiling. She read it carefully. "Your client's alleged agreement isn't recorded. That doesn't necessarily invalidate it."
No.
"But we need to establish whether it is authentic, when it was created, and what was exchanged." My heartbeat filled my ears. The envelope contained more than I expected. Bank statements, receipts, copies of old checks. My father had saved everything. The judge turned another page. "These records indicate the payments Mr. Richard Hart claims he made toward the property were actually loans." Richard finally spoke. "Dad needed money. I helped him." Judge Brooks looked at him. "Were you repaid?" Richard hesitated. "Yes." "How much?" He didn't answer. Mercer stepped in. "Your Honor, my client doesn't have every transaction memorized, but my father's records did." I pulled out one of the receipts. "There's a record here."
Everyone looked at me.
I handed the document to the clerk. "This payment was from Richard to my father." The judge examined it. "Do you know what this is?" "A repayment receipt." I stared at the page. There were several more. Richard claimed he supported Dad for years, but Dad documented every payment as a loan. Every loan had been repaid. Mercer reviewed the documents. His face changed as he read. Then he looked at Richard. "Your client represented these payments as permanent contributions?" Richard said nothing. I finally understood what Dad had done. He hadn't simply kept receipts. He had created a trail. Then I remembered the letter. I unfolded it again. Dad's handwriting filled the page. "Maya, if Richard ever brings this to court, don't fight him with anger. Make him prove every word." My eyes burned. He had known Richard might try. The judge asked Mercer where the original of his client's agreement was. "We have a certified copy." "Certified by whom?" Mercer hesitated. "The notary who witnessed it." "Is that notary available?" He looked down. "No, Your Honor." The judge remained calm. "Then the court will need proper authentication before giving this document significant weight." Richard leaned toward Mercer and whispered. For the first time since I entered the courtroom, they looked uncertain. Then Judge Brooks said something that made my stomach tighten. "There is another document." I looked at her. "What document?" She checked the file. "An earlier property filing. Your father referenced it in these records." Mercer stood. "Your Honor, we have no knowledge of such a filing." Richard went pale. And suddenly I knew. He did know. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Hart, do you know?" Richard swallowed.
No.
But his voice wasn't convincing. Judge Brooks leaned back. "The county records should answer that question." She ordered the clerk to retrieve the file. The courtroom waited. Richard stared at the floor. I watched him. For 22 years, I thought my father was protecting a house. Now I wondered if he had been protecting me. And whatever was inside that missing property record. Richard was terrified I was about to find it. The clerk returned 20 minutes later carrying a thin county file. I could hear my own heartbeat. Judge Brooks opened the folder and began reading. Richard wouldn't look at me. His attorney leaned closer to him and whispered something. Richard shook his head. Then the judge pulled out a document. "This," she said, "was recorded 22 years ago." She placed it on the desk. I leaned forward. It was a property transfer agreement. My father's name was there. So was mine. And at the bottom was Richard's signature. I stared at it. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Judge Brooks looked at me. "It means your father had already established the ownership arrangement for this property." Mercer stood immediately. "Your Honor, we'd like time to review this document." "You've had time," she replied. "The county has had it for 22 years. Mercer looked frustrated. "This document may not reflect the final wishes of Mr. Hart." Judge Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Then why did your client sign it?" Silence. Richard finally spoke. Dad didn't understand what he was signing. The judge looked at him. "Your signature appears beneath the statement acknowledging your niece's future ownership of the property." Richard's face went pale. I looked at him. "You knew." He didn't answer. "You knew Dad left the house to me." "I knew he wanted you to have it eventually." "Eventually?" My voice shook. "You told me he promised it to you." Richard looked away. The judge continued examining the document. "This is not merely a statement of intent. It is part of the recorded property history." Mercer sat down. For the first time, his confidence was gone. Judge Brooks turned toward me. "Miss Hart, do you have any other documents from your father?" I opened my folder. "Yes." I pulled out the final letter. "My father wrote this." The judge read it quietly. Then she handed it back. He was very clear. I looked down at the page. Dad had written, "Maya, if you're reading this, Richard has probably tried to convince you that you're not entitled to this house. Don't let him make you doubt yourself. I made my decision years ago. The house belongs to you. I want you to keep it only if it gives you peace. If it doesn't, sell it. But never surrender it because someone makes you feel guilty for being my daughter." I couldn't speak. For months, I had felt like I was fighting Richard alone. But Dad had left me something more valuable than property. He had left me certainty. Judge Brooks reviewed the documents one final time. Then she looked at Mercer. "Do you have additional evidence supporting your client's claim?" Mercer slowly stood. "No, Your Honor." "And the original of the alleged transfer agreement?" "We cannot produce it today." "Then the court cannot rely on an unauthenticated copy to overturn the recorded property documents." She turned toward Richard. "Your claim to ownership is denied." The words seemed to echo through the courtroom. Denied. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt exhausted. The house was still standing. My father's house. My house. Richard's attorney began gathering his papers. Richard remained seated. Then he looked at me. "You're really going to keep it?" I stared at him. "You try to take it from me. We're family." I almost laughed. "Family doesn't need to steal from family." His expression hardened. "You think Dad would want this?" I looked at him for a long moment. "No." He smiled slightly, as if he'd finally found an argument. Then I finished. "He would have wanted you to respect his decision." The smile disappeared. Richard stood and walked out. I watched him leave through the courtroom doors. Judge Brooks called me back before I could go. "Miss Hart." I turned. She smiled gently. "There is something your father asked me years ago that I never forgot." I waited. He asked me what would happen if his daughter ever had to stand alone. My throat tightened. "What did you tell him?" She looked directly at me. "I told him that standing alone didn't mean being powerless." I remembered being 16 in that little legal aid office. My father beside me, the same woman sitting across the desk, the same calm voice telling me not to sign something I didn't understand. I finally understood why Dad had kept everything. He wasn't expecting Richard to betray him. He was simply making sure that if Richard ever did, the truth would survive him. I thanked Judge Brooks and walked outside. The afternoon sun hit my face. For the first time in months, I could breathe. I drove to my father's house. When I opened the front door, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. The blue chair, the workshop, the photographs, the old clock ticking in the hallway. I walked into the kitchen and found the coffee mug Dad used every morning. I picked it up. Then I smiled. Not because I'd defeated Richard. Because Dad had been right. The truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to survive long enough to be heard. Months later, I repaired the front porch. It was something Dad had wanted to do for years. I kept his workshop untouched. I planted flowers beside the front steps. And I stayed. Not because Richard had failed to take the house, but because I finally understood what Dad had really left me. He hadn't left me walls and windows. He had left me a choice. And I chose to keep the place where our family had begun. Sometimes I think about that courtroom. I walked in without a lawyer, convinced I was already defeated. My uncle had money. His attorney had experience. I had one folder and an envelope from my father. But when the judge looked at me and asked, "You don't remember me, do you?" I didn't realize she was about to remind me of something even more important. My father had never expected me to win because I was stronger than everyone else. He expected me to win because he had made sure the truth was waiting for me. And that day, standing alone in court, I finally learned the difference between being alone and being powerless.